Reading logs for homework. Colour it in. Make sure you've done the right amount of time. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? I just sounded a bit like our kids when they're mad at us. I'm so angry. Today, we're going to discuss the question of reading logs because it came up recently when a parent asked me at a parent night, what's the deal? How do we play this? I'm just not sure, but my child chafes at the reading log. Hello, welcome to the Happy Families podcast, real parenting solutions every day on Australia's most downloaded parenting podcast. We are Justin and Kylie Coulson.
We love to read in our house. I would actually say we are voracious readers.
I thought you were going to say ferocious for a minute. Voracious is the right word, yeah. So you must have been reading. Big vocabulary. I love it.
We have 6 children and every single one of them are bookworms, to the point where we've had, I would say, numerous children who've almost been run over.
Hit by vehicles.
By vehicles as they've walked their way to school with their nose in a book.
When we used to live in Wollongong, I know I'm cutting you off, but we had this one daughter who would read so much, she would literally just read as she walked and literally almost got hit by the bus more than once because she just walked to school with her nose in the book.
We've had multiple children with torches under the covers after lights out.
All the time.
And our biggest struggle has actually been keeping them in books, in that we've got a 10-year-old who's now reading books that are 500 and 600 pages long.
Yeah.
Which means often it's trying to find books that are appropriate for her age and yet stimulate her reading level. It's a really tricky place to be.
I'm not going to bury the lead. I'm going to come out and say it right now at the top of this podcast episode. None of our kids have ever filled in a reading log. I have forbidden it. I'm anti-reading log, and that's our conversation today. Number 1, what the problem with reading logs is, and number 2, how to get your kids to love reading, which is something that we've done quite well.
Reading is the key skill to education. It's literally the gateway to all other skills. And if we can get this one thing right with our kids, they're going to make it all right in the world.
I love the way that you said that. Let's go through some stats. I think there's some relevance here. It's important. Oxford University Press did some research in Australia with Aussie families, found that 25% of parents only read to their kids once a week or not at all. That's a quarter of families are not reading to their kids in any meaningful way on a week-to-week basis. 56% of parents were worried about their own reading ability and therefore were unlikely to read to the kids because they don't like how they read.
That, to me, is staggering.
We have an issue in this country with people who are barely functionally literate. This has been an ongoing issue. We've got a great education system, but too many kids fall through the cracks and become adults who really struggle to read, who don't enjoy reading at all. Happy to listen to an audiobook, but don't want to pick one up and read it.
Wow.
The other thing that came out here is that only 50% of parents are routinely reading to their young children. That drops to 30% in lower income families. There is a relationship between socioeconomic status and the amount that you read to your kids. Something that's also fascinating to me is the relationship between your education level and your income level and how many books you've got in your house. So kids that come from more educated families and wealthier families tend to be around books a lot. And they reckon that there's a word gap between those who are surrounded by books and those who aren't, those who are being raised in well-educated families and those who aren't. Up to maybe 1 million words a year, the kids in the lower socioeconomic groups are missing out on. So if you're not getting that extra 1 million words a year across a lifespan or across a decade of childhood, that adds up to an enormous amount from a literacy point of view. And whatever it was that you said before about reading being the gateway to all education, reading is the foundational element of helping our kids to thrive. You look at those stats and it's clear, it's abundantly clear, if kids don't read, then they're not going to become better readers, which means that they're less likely to become leaders. They're less likely to do well in any number of other domains. Doesn't mean that they can't, it's just harder for them.
So what happened at your recent parent night that has sparked this conversation?
Yeah, so I've made no secret of this and I've been making noise about it for 15 years. I'm not a fan of homework in primary school. There's not a shred of credible evidence that supports its use. What's curious to me is when I'm at parent nights now and I say it, all the teachers, I make a big deal about it. I'm like, oh no, the principal's here. I hope I'm not going to get kicked out. I hope that they'll have me back after I say this. And then I'll talk about how in primary school there's just no evidence to support its usefulness. And the teachers all start applauding. But the parents look at me like I've just swallowed poison in front of them. They can't believe that I've done it. And they're saying, why would you say this? Like homework's great. And so I talk through all of the research around limited efficacy, kids who already know how to do it, it's boring for them. Kids who can't do it, it's just frustrating, makes them feel even more incompetent. And then I make a very clear point. The one thing that is associated with great academic outcomes in primary school is kids reading. But we should not be telling our kids to fill in the homework log, to colour in the homework wheel to show that they've done their 10 pages or their 20 minutes or whatever. They should read because they love it. That's my emphasis. The principals always applaud. The teachers always say, oh, thank goodness, because we hate assigning homework and having to follow up on homework as well. But the reading log thing really created a bit of a stir at this parent night recently. And that's why I thought, doctor's desk, let's do it.
Well, it wouldn't be a doctor's desk if you weren't referring to a whole heap of numbers and stats and things that hurt my brain. What is the research telling us about reading logs?
I don't want to hurt your brain. I'm only going to refer to one study, although there are more studies than just this one. These studies really build out of what's known as the motivation literature. Okay, so there's a whole lot of other research that supports what this one study is talking about. A lot of people say, well, anyone can find one study that says one thing. So I'm using this as an example of an entire research body that underpins what I'm about to say. This is from Princeton University. So we're talking about a very prestigious university with excellent researchers. Somebody called Sarah Pack at Princeton did this research paper looking at the effect of mandatory reading logs on children's motivation to read. Got a whole bunch of second and third grade students. They were assigned either a mandatory log or a voluntary log. They were surveyed about their motivation to read at baseline and then 2 months down the track once they'd been keeping the log for a couple of months. And here's what Sarah and her colleagues found. Students with mandatory reading logs expressed declines in both interest in reading and attitudes towards recreational reading in comparison to peers with voluntary logs, and attitudes towards academic reading decreased significantly from pre to post test across conditions. In other words, by making a child fill in a reading log, you essentially help them to see reading as something that is not fun to do.
This reminds me of the conversation we had with Alfie Cohn in relation to punishment by rewards. We're actually suggesting by putting a mandatory ceiling on it, whether it be you read for 10 minutes or you read 10 pages or whatever it is, that we actually have to give them reason to do it, because doing the task in and of itself is not stimulating, is not worth their time, is not worth their energy.
It's not sufficiently rewarding. Exactly, yeah.
And the devastation of that is that this study recognises that previous to having reading logs, there was actually a level of motivation. It would have varied from child to child.
Of course.
But there was already, we're born curious.
Right.
We're born desiring to understand and know the world around us. And reading is a wonderful way that we can do that. And we've just literally chopped it off at the legs.
Yeah, it's turning reading into a chore. And like you said, it puts a ceiling or a limit on it. It's kind of like the whole, hey kids, you need to go and practice the piano for 30 minutes. And when my mum used to say that, I procrastinated, I fiddled around on the piano, so long as I sat at the piano for 30 minutes, and I watched the clock the whole time rather than looking at the music or considering the music that I might produce. By having to do it as a chore, it made it horrible, and I couldn't wait to quit the piano. It just doesn't work. So after the break, let's talk about how we can help our kids to love reading. Okay, Kylie, we got to talk about how to help kids to just fall in love with reading.
So I actually don't have a single memory of my parents reading to me.
Oh, wow.
And I might be doing them a disservice, but I don't remember at all being read to as a child. What I do remember is my dad used to tell me stories. So he would come to my bedside and he would share stories with me by my bedside as opposed to reading. I don't feel like as a child I had a great love of books at all. I wasn't a particularly curious child, and it wasn't until I got really, really sick as a 14-year-old and one of my leaders from church brought me a book. I was stuck at home for 3 months without being able to go to school. I wasn't socializing, and she handed me this book and I was like, yeah, whatever, I'm never going to read that. And one day I was so bored that I picked it up.
I was so bored, I decided to read.
Bored, I picked it up and I devoured that book from cover to cover within a couple of days. That was the turning point for me. And so when I think about this idea of how we go about creating a love of reading, for me, having books accessible to your kids is number one, hands down, such an important part of that process.
So that ties in with our experience that we shared on I'll Do Better Tomorrow a couple of weeks ago with our daughter. We left that my gut friends, I've got friends in my gut that help me to be healthy, whatever that book was. We left it there so that she would see it, and she walked past it dozens of times before she finally picked up and decided to read it. And all of a sudden, here's this kid who's saying, I need to improve my diet. I need to get this stuff into my belly because I've got these gut friends that will do good things for me if they get the right nutrition and nutrients. So the accessibility of books is crucial.
But not having them, like you can't have them on the bookshelf half the time, especially for younger kids.
Because then they're just decorative.
That's right.
Yeah, they've got to be within arm's reach.
So recently, Emily has loved playing with a Lego, but now that we've got a baby walking around the house, we've had to put it away.
Yeah.
And she won't pull it out because that's too much effort because it's not in sight.
Reduce the friction, make it the easy option. And this is why people are looking at phones, right? Because the phones are friction-free and they're massively stimulating.
Yeah.
You don't have to do nearly as much work as you do with other things. You know what, though? It's a hollow reward compared to what you get from a book. Let's talk about how to get your kids to love reading. You don't remember your parents reading to you? From the time I was born, my parents read and read and read to me. And I knew my books so well that if they tried to skip a line because they were tired and they were falling asleep on the floor beside me while they read, I would rouse on them. I'd get them in trouble and I'd say, no, that's not what it says. And then I would recite what the words were on that page because I couldn't read, but I knew that book inside and out.
I know a few years after we got married, your mum sent us a copy of the little golden book,
right?
Donald Duck's Toy Train. Is that what it is?
Donald Duck's New Toy Train. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah. Donald's right. I'm 50 years old this year. They were reading it to me when I was 3. I still remember the first couple of pages. Donald Duck had a new toy train and it was a beauty too. And then it starts describing all the carriages to the little red caboose on the back. Like, I still remember it. Like, that's the impact that reading has on you. You remember it those years later. It bonds you with your kids. Read. Number one, read to your kids. Read slower than you think you need to so that their minds can keep up with what you're saying. And use voices and expression. Ask them questions about the pictures. Ask them questions about the characters. Ask them questions about what they would do. I remember reading The Magic Faraway Tree to the kids, our kids, and saying things to them like, what would you do if you were climbing up the tree and this happened? How would it feel to go down the slide with Moonbeam or Mr. Saucepan Man or whatever it is? Like asking them questions as you read, or going through The Princess Bride and having them terrified about what's about to happen. It makes the book come alive when they see your love for it and they see your interest in not just the book, but in their reactions to the book. Oh, read to them.
So that's your number one tip.
Have I made that clear?
I think so.
Oh, I'm so passionate about this.
I think number 2 has to be, we have to model it. They have to see our love of books.
Yeah.
You do a pretty good job of it because on any given day, there's about...
there are dozens of books. How many books? I'm usually reading at least 3 books at a time.
You are, and they are so varied. There's it's just such an eclectic array of genres and topics at any given time.
I'm reading a book at the moment called How Infrastructure Works. And you just fell asleep when I said that. You're like, Why would you read that?
Why would you read that?
It's so incredible. It's fascinating. And I've got all my psychology books and everything. Anyway, make sure the kids see you reading instead of staring at your phone. Model it. We're almost out of time. The third key thing, and I want to share a story here. We don't have time for it, so I'm going to do it quickly, is the importance of autonomy. I'm a book snob. What I mean by that is I like to read books that are either outstandingly good fiction, and I don't read much of that, maybe a handful of fiction books a year, or I like to read books that are really intelligently written by really intelligent people who are it's going to change the way that I think. I like to read really provocative, thought-provoking books. I like to read textbooks and academic papers. So when we could not get our youngest daughter to read, and she came home one day with a graphic novel about dragons called Wings of Fire. And when I say this at parent nights, Kylie, everybody just cracks up because everyone knows Wings of Fire. I was incensed. I'm like, you're not reading this. The plot's pathetic. The characters are poorly developed. The illustrations aren't even good. And it's so basic. And you looked at me and said something like, hey, parenting expert, she wants to read. Let's just let her read the graphic novel. And I reckon, because it's so short, it's 150 pages or whatever, but it's a graphic novel. So she read it, 4 times in 2 days? Mm. And
But in and of itself, she read it 4 times in 2 days.
Which made me angry, right? You're saying this is great. And I'm like, no, because it's rubbish. But you sort of, it's not like you went behind my back, but you sneakily went down to the bookstore and purchased the entire series. And she read the entire series, 8 times in a month or something. And then you came to me and said, have you seen her devouring these books? And I was frustrated and said, they're rubbish. They're rubbish. I'm not happy about it. I can't believe you spent money on graphic novels because I'm a book snob. And you said, yeah, but she's reading. And then you went and bought her the first novel. So these graphic novels have been turned into 150-page books.
Well, they were actually books first.
Oh, is that right?
The graphic novels came after, and I brought her the novels, but she wasn't interested.
Oh, okay. So the novel was already there.
Yes.
So because she's now read the entire set of graphic novels, she picked up the first novel and she read it.
That's right.
And that's when I went, I still don't like that she's reading this stuff, but she's reading real books now.
Well, the funny thing is we have gone past graphic novels now. She hardly picks them up at all, even though they would be still considered some of her favourites. And now we're on to 500 and 600-page novels, just because it's about finding whatever piques their interest. So maybe it's automotives, maybe it's dinosaurs, whatever it is, it doesn't actually matter.
I don't care if it's a magazine, just so long as it's not online. Keep them offline because research shows that they process it differently when they're holding paper in their hands. That's the only thing I'd say. I know that some people will be upset about that, but I'm still a bit of a purist and a little bit of a snob, and the evidence is definitely in favour of holding the book.
100%.
Yeah. So
it's a whole experience.
The amazing thing is, Kylie, as you said, she's now reading these huge books, and we are begging her to close the book and go to bed, or close the book and get in the car, or close the book and come to dinner. Or, if she walked to school, we'd probably have worries about her getting hit by buses like some of our other kids who have almost had the same thing happen.
It's interesting. We've been to a few appointments lately, and she's been sitting in the reception area reading a book. And when the doctor has come out to meet with us,
double take,
she's like, wow, you don't see that very often.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
you've never told me that. That's beautiful. Well, we really hope this solves the issue of reading logs. They're just unnecessary. They put a ceiling on kids' motivation and interest, and they feel like a chore. They make reading feel like a chore. There are better ways to get your kids to love reading. We hope that this has been helpful. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. More information and more resources to make your family happier are available at happyfamilies.com.au.